Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Decoding the Unknown, where we decode mysteries. Danny has written it, I read it, that's the format of the show. We're talking about Violet Charlesworth. Charlesworth is possibly the poshest surname I've ever heard. Somehow Charlesworth sounds posher than like Windsor. The murky fate of the mysterious Edwardian heiress. Well, there you go, she's an heiress. No wonder she's called Charlesworth. The late-night journey of the bottle green Minerva sports car speeding along the North Wales Clifftop Road in January 1909 was never destined to be a typically jolly outing for all concerned. There was a sports car in 1909? Immediately I'm like, wait, Edwardian? And then the first line is sports car? What? For starters, the chauffeur, Albert Watts, wasn't even driving the car. It was actually being driven by his boss, a young woman of all things, which might not seem so extraordinary today, but this was back in an era where the rare sight of a woman behind the wheel was enough to make male drivers spill a bottle of port all over the dashboard in horror. The past, so you just be drink driving and women can't drive. I mean, other than the drink driving part. Wait, can women drive in Saudi Arabia? Didn't they change that, right? It's like, okay, fine, women can drive, Jesus. What's next, voting? But 24-year-old Violet Charlesworth was no ordinary woman. At the time, she was probably one of the most well-known residents of the city of St Asaph in Wales, largely because she was a member of one of the most fabulously wealthy families in the neighbourhood. She wasn't the only Charlesworth travelling in the Minerva on that night. Alongside the slightly useless non-driving chauffeur Albert, the other passenger in the car was Violet's younger sister Lillian. But it was Violet who usually courted all the attention, as she had become something of a local celebrity and the public face of the family about town. It was also common knowledge that Violet in particular was on the very brink of becoming even wealthier by a long way, just as soon as she hit her 25th birthday. Oh, she's got like a trust fund or something? But would she ever live to see the eagerly awaited inheritance payday, which was now only 2 weeks away? Oh my, I don't know what is going to happen today, but all I can say is that we've just introduced motive for her murder by someone who's going to benefit from getting that inheritance. The signs are not looking good. Dressed in a flowing crimson cloak, Violet puts her foot down as the bottle green Minerva approaches a sharp coastal bend, which was known locally as Demon's Turn, but would soon acquire a brand new nickname. Sounds like a bad idea. It's a journey that the passengers have made many times before, but they don't quite make it all the way past the bend this time. The car ends up hurtling into a seawall and coming to an abrupt halt just a few inches from the edge of the cliff. Jesus. And like hurtling into a seawall? In a car these days, you'd be like, yeah, it'll be fine. Like, I saw a terrible accident the other day. Well, I didn't see it. It was, the entire other side of the highway was closed. I was driving home from work. And I come across it. It's just a whole bunch of cars. Like, one's on its side. One's, like, had its front completely ruined. And it's just like, you look at them and you're like, oh, yeah, I mean, those cars are really ruined. But that passenger compartment looks pretty fine. And modern cars are just incredible, but 1909 is just like, you slam into a seawall, I feel like it's like, you're just going to be a mist. You see what happens when you don't let Albert drive? They'll be giving women the vote next. You just wait and see. Oh, Danny and I doing the same joke. Very nice.
Just before we continue with today's episode, let me thank our fantastic sponsor today, and that is Vessi. And these are their storm berths, the high tops and the low tops. I have been wearing Vessis pretty much exclusively for, I think, almost 3 years now, since they first started sponsoring me. They're the best shoes ever. I wouldn't wear anything. Honestly, even if Vessi weren't sponsoring me, since they gave me the first pair a few years ago, I would have just continued to buy them because they're just fantastic shoes. They're completely waterproof and not just water resistant with this high top, for example, all the way up to here, waterproof with these, obviously a little bit lower because there's, no material here. But this is also super waterproof. Your socks will stay completely dry. It was snowing this morning. I put on my pair, not this pair. This is still fresh from the box, but I have a white pair of these high tops and I was wearing them this morning out to the car, traipsing through the snow, and I have completely dry feet because that's the magic of Vessi. It's a material called Dymatex, which does it all. It's super versatile. You can wear these, if it's a bit more snowy outside. These, if it's a little bit warmer, but still wintry. They've got a shoe for every season, every eventuality. So what I'd recommend is that you surprise your loved ones with the gift of cozy dry feet this year. Head over to Vessi.com to shop Vessi's waterproof collection for only $99. It's the kind of gift that'll make you that person's favorite person because Vessi is that Good. Big thank you to Bessie for sponsoring. And now back to today's episode.
Albert Watts and Lillian Charlesworth are dazed, but thankfully not seriously hurt. Well, they can't have smashed into it that hard, hurtled into a sea wall, come to an abrupt halt. How fast could they possibly be going? In like a car back in the day, you'd just die if you were going at speed. However, it seems that Violet Charlesworth was not so fortunate. It's believed that she was thrown through the windscreen from the impact of the crash and sent hurtling down into the sea below. What, everyone else was just wearing a seatbelt in 1909? Come on now. Yet although a few of her belongings were picked up near the scene, her body was nowhere to be found. And as this tragedy sparked headlines across the world, there emerged an obvious killer question that everyone was now asking. What was the point of the chauffeur being in the car if he wasn't even driving? If all it takes to be a chauffeur is to sit quietly in the passenger seat, I'm sure even a non-driver like me might have been in with a chance of landing that cushy number. Well, I just assumed that because, normally she's driven around and they're driving along this nice sea road and she's like, Albert, let me drive. And Albert's like, yes, Mom. And he slides over into the passenger seat while she takes the wheel. I don't think that's particularly unusual. But there were plenty of other more serious questions piling up, as not everything about the accident and the vanishing body made an awful lot of sense. And the biggest question of all was, whatever happened to the tragic Edwardian heiress who went missing just before she was really about to hit the big time? Well, someone murdered her. That's my vibe. I think someone murdered her, and it's probably going to be someone who benefits from this. The story quickly unfolded into a massive media scramble for the truth, a brutal betrayal orchestrated by a pushy mother, a lucrative silent movie deal, several St. Bernard's dogs, a hell of a lot of properly pissed off people, and a shocking discovery made around 300 miles away from that sharp bend of road, which is now known as Violet's Leap. Oh, that's... Dudes. That is not very nice. She was ejected through the windscreen of a car. She's probably like, she's not wearing a seatbelt. No, I'll be thrown clear of the wreckage. Doesn't work like that. At least that doesn't work, right? Or that happens like 1 in 1,000 times. The rest of the time, obviously you should be wearing a seatbelt. Stop being insane. Knights in white satin. Spare a cheery thought for the poor souls who dropped dead on the very first day of their retirement. Is that an urban legend, or is that actually a common thing? Like people retire and then they're more likely to die because suddenly they're like, oh, I don't really have a purpose. I've just got nothing to do. And then, I don't know, whenever I get to the end of a work week and it's the weekend, I won't feel tired during the work week. You get to the weekend and you're like, oh. I feel like retirement is that built up for your whole life, and then that is like, and then you die. Right? Regardless of the cause of death, that's got to feel like a proper sharp kick to the fun factory. Just as sharp kick to your heart during a heart attack, Danny. Just as you're on the cusp of finally kicking back and reaping the rewards you've earned from a lifetime of putting your nose to the grindstone, the cruel hand of fate robs you of your well-deserved final blissful chapter. Now that the goalposts of retirement age are constantly getting pushed back further and further, perhaps a bigger concern today is that we'll throw a 7 long before we even make it to the carriage clock. I've never heard of carriage clock. The personalized cufflinks, the comedy plaque, and the gold-plated tin opener. These are the traditional retirement items. The gold-plated tin opener. But the story of Violet Charlesworth feels like a particularly tragic variant on this theme, as she appeared to kick the bucket, or at least completely disappear into thin air, just as the young woman was finally about to make it to the day that everyone knew she'd been dreaming about for years. The Charlesworth family were already pretty well off by the looks of it. Violet lived, they called her an heiress. She's got to be rich, right? What's that song? Is it Rolling Stones? Her daughter, she's an heiress, owns a block in... somewhere? St. John's Wood, I want to say? Owns a block in St. John. That doesn't sound right. Fuck. Doesn't matter. Let's move on. Violet lived with her parents, her sister Lillian, and her brother Fred in the family home, which was a pretty swishy mansion in the city of St. Asaph in Wales, and it was clear that the whole family relished the high life. But Violet, an Englishwoman now living in Wales while harbouring a strange obsession for Scotland, perhaps relished it more than most. She was about to take the family wealth to a whole new level without actually having to do anything. Wait, how? Where's the money coming from? Just about everyone in St. Asaph was well aware that Violet was the goddaughter of none other than the late Major General Charles Gordon, a highly decorated British war hero with a strong connection to the local folk as he spent much of his early military career based in Pembrokeshire in Wales. He went on to serve in China, where he earned the nickname of Chinese Gordon after leading the ever-victorious army, a force made up of Chinese and Western soldiers, to a long chain of victories against all odds when supporting the Qing dynasty in suppressing the Taiping Rebellion. He later received distinguished honors from both China and Britain, including the boogylicious-sounding Order of the Dragon from China and the slightly less so Order of the Bath from Britain, before finally meeting his end, bravely defending Khartoum in Sudan from rebels in 1885. This guy sounds like he had an extraordinarily interesting life. This fearless national hero may have disappeared forever from the battlefield, but Chinese Gordon left something behind for his beloved goddaughter, a portion of his estate worth a reported £100,000. Oh my god, in 1909? I don't know what that's worth, but it's going to be a fortune. £15 million, Danny says. Yeah, that's a hell of a lot of money. I had no idea that a British Major General was paid quite so handsomely, and this sum only represented part of his estate. Maybe he married a rich wife along the way, or maybe he's just one of those rich people who becomes an officer in the military, because that happens all the time. He probably just had loads of family money. The only proviso was that the money would not be awarded to Violet Charlesworth until she hit the ripe old age of 25. That may well have seemed like a lifetime away back when Violet was a teenager. Still, the Charlesworth family weren't doing too badly for themselves in the meantime, although life hadn't always been quite so peachy. Violet Gordon Charlesworth was born in the English market town of Stafford in the West Midlands in 1884 to Miriam and John Charlesworth. Violet was the youngest of at least 4 children, including brother Fred and sister Lillian, but precise details... 16 plus 9... So she was 25 when Oh yeah, Danny said she was 2 weeks away. So she was right on the... I didn't realize. Sorry, I could have put that together rather than having to add up her age from when she was born, because Danny already told us. It's 25. We do know from fragmented records that the eldest daughter, Nellie, would sadly not live to see her 21st birthday, although her cause of death is unclear today. Probably, people in the past is just young people die all the time. Super common. The past, everybody. Mother Miriam was a homemaker, whilst Father John apparently saw himself as a shrewd businessman, although in reality he sounds more like a slightly low-rent wheeler dealer who couldn't sit still for very long. Over the years, he had a go at flogging insurance, a brief attempt at running a hotel, and a lengthier stint as a ship chandler selling essential supplies and equipment for ships, although some of his stock may have fallen off the stern of a poop deck, if you get what I mean.
Aye, know what I mean, nudge, know what I mean, say no more.
No I don't. Oh no, I don't get it, what does it mean?
Know what I mean, say no more.
It was reported that Charlesworths had humble and modest roots during their earlier life in England, in which they showed a tendency for moving around the country quite a bit, hopping from Staffordshire to Wolverhampton to Derby, probably in line with whatever John was up to at the time. But that makes it sound a bit like they spent their days licking sweet wrappers and begging for second helpings in soup kitchens. They were doing okay, and they never went hungry. It's just that their fairly ordinary lifestyle felt like a sharp contrast to how they spent their later days. Yeah, I mean, this isn't ultra uncommon. People get rich. It's, it happens. And they enjoy their money. Because by the turn of the 20th century, things were definitely looking up for the Charlesworth family. They took the plunge and moved to North Wales at some point in the early 1900s, first living in the seaside town of Rhyl for a few years before settling comfortably into a stately manor house in St. Asaph in 1908. And to where, look, these pronunciations, I have no idea. Rhyl, R-H-Y-L, I'm sure in Welsh it's pronounced something like, blah, blah, blah. But even if I looked it up, I'm still not going to be able to pronounce it because it's Welsh. It's weird. It's hard to say.
Oh, right. Now, how would you say that?
Jeffrey.
So this is, Achavi. So if someone came here...
We're not quite sure what happened to the other siblings. Some of them may well have fled the nest by this point. But it was just Violet, Lillian and Fred who were living it up with their parents in a sumptuous mansion with 7 bedrooms, a coach house, vast gardens, and hopefully a well-stocked wine cellar, a skating rink and a hot tub around the back. And Violet Charlesworth had certainly developed a taste for the finer things in life. She was regularly spotted around town sporting expensive furs and dripping from head to toe with diamonds, and she wasn't averse to slipping on a tiara if she'd been invited to a really posh do. Yeah, because she's now growing up with money. The parents made money, so they'll be in touch with what things were like before. But Violet, not so much. She grew up and they were always rich. Violet was usually accompanied by at least one of the 12 St. Bernard's dogs that she was reported to have owned. Oh my god. Which, speaking as an avid lover of dogs, is perhaps a tad excessive unless you have one or two helpers to assist with the walks and the poop patrols in the garden, which, I mean, look, they live in a 7-bedroom mansion back in the day. They're gonna have staff. She had no less than 6 fancy sports cars at her disposal, in which she was regularly seen racing around the countryside and coastal roads, including, of course, a certain bottle green Minerva manufactured in Belgium, which perhaps wasn't the very best at handling sharp bends in the roads. 6 fancy sports cars in 1909. These people were, they were rich. £15 million? I feel like they're richer than that. Slightly weirdly, for an English lady now living in Wales with no Scottish roots whatsoever, she also appeared to have quite a deep infatuation with old bonny Scotland, the land of the brave, the thistle, and the frozen Mars bar. Wait, the frozen Mars bar? I thought they fried Mars bars in Scotland. When she wasn't dressed in furs and diamonds, she liked to pose for photographs in full Highland dress, complete with kilted skirt and bagpipes and piping hat. Why? You're not Scottish. While she never primarily lived in Scotland, she did rent a nice country house in Inverness, which was plastered in tartan wallpaper. She also owned a player piano, which exclusively churned out traditional Scottish music on a loop, and she even had a go at writing her own composition entitled Come Back to Scotland. Why is she so obsessed with Scotland? This reminds me of like people who are obsessed with Japan. Like, they're just like super into all Japanese culture for some reason, which, I mean, yeah, I don't have anything against Japanese culture, but some people are really into it. A copy of the sheet music was reportedly sent to King Edward VII, although it's not known if he ever got the track laid down on phonograph cylinders to shove inside the royal jukebox. But she was certainly very keen to play on the Highlander angle and make out as if she was some kind of long-lost Scottish folk hero. This is rich people shit, isn't it?
Come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom!
All of this might make Violet sound like an Edwardian version of an influencer or gossip page princess who was slightly prone to vulgar displays of wealth and always desperate for attention. Totally. But I'm not so sure about that. She enjoyed spending her money on things that she liked, and she saw no reason to hide her wealth. I mean, you could do both things. Like, both things can be true. She can enjoy spending her money on things she likes and also look, a bit vulgar. That's okay. And on the whole, she was never really viewed as a self-obsessed publicity hound. If anything, she was viewed as being quite generous with her money and time. She was known as being a very heavy tipper in hotels and made regular contributions to the community, including the donation of silver cups for local football competitions, although admittedly she usually made sure that she was the one handing them over and getting her face in the papers again. But although there was potential for Violet Charlesworth to be grumpily dismissed as an annoying poser with too much money to burn, she was generally liked and warmly received by everyone she met. Admired, even. The Edwardian era probably wasn't the best time in history to be a woman, but Violet wasn't afraid to ruffle a few feathers and demonstrate that she didn't give a shit about convention or antiquated expectations of how she should be spending her time. I mean, yeah, sure, but she's rich. Different rules for rich people, especially back in the day. The fact that she raced around in 6 sports cars, often alone for long distances late at night, was a pretty big deal at the time. I'm told that licensed female drivers now slightly outnumbered licensed male drivers in the US at least, and have done since 2015, really. But back then, I mean, I just expected it to be equal, to be honest. But back then, in Edwardian England, it was a very different story, with women accounting for a mere 5% of licensed drivers. I'm stressing that we're talking about licensed drivers here, as we're not covering all the hundreds of thousands of women joyriders who were presumably stealing cars and terrorizing the towns and villages in the early hours of Sunday morning whilst lobbing traffic cones at police vehicles in pursuit. I also bet just more people drove without a license back in the day. Like 1909 cars are going to be pretty new. People just be like, oh yeah, no, I just don't have my license. I just like driving around. The small percentage of women drivers in the early 20th century would have at least been able to learn everything they needed to know by 1909 thanks to the publication of Dorothy Levitt's top-selling book, The Woman and the Car, a chatty little handbook for all women who motor or want to motor. Okay, a chatty little handbook? It sounds like demeaning somehow. It's like, oh, well, we couldn't explain this to women in a technical way, so we had to make it chatty. Some of Dorothy's pearls of wisdom for Edwardian drivers without a penis include: the little drawer under the seat of the car is the secret of the dainty motorist. The following articles are what I advise you to have in this recess: a pair of clean gloves, an extra handkerchief, clean veil, powder puff, hairpins, and ordinary pins, and a hand mirror. Under no circumstances wear lace or fluffy adjuncts to your toilette. If you do, you will regret them before you've even driven half a dozen miles. Drive slowly past anyone driving or riding a horse, and if a lady or child is on top, stop the engine. It is an act of courtesy. Dogs, chickens, and other domestic animals at large are not pedestrians, and if one is driving at regulation speed, one is not responsible for their untimely ends. Holy shit, it's just like, look, if a dog's in your way, just can run it over. If you're going to drive alone in the highways and byways, it might be advisable to carry a small revolver. I have an automatic Colt and find it very easy to handle, as there's practically no recoil. That started off quite breezy and bubbly, but it soon took a dark turn. Yeah, make sure. Take your powder puff, mirror, and a gun.
Guys? What does a pregnancy test look like?
No, it's like a thin piece of plastic with a thing on the end of it.
Okay, so this is definitely a gun.
Whoa! Yeah.
And you'd think that Dorothy might have considered slowing down a bit for a stray dog in the road instead of shrugging, reaching for the powder puff, and waiting for the inevitable bump. The Essential Handbook had not quite hit the shelves before Violet Charlesworth took her final spin in a motor, but I wouldn't have thought that she'd have needed the advice anyway, and she could probably have written an edgier version of the book herself, just as she could drive the car better than her own chauffeur. The point of even having a chauffeur in the first place is still a bit of a mystery. Well, because most of the time you probably don't want to drive the car yourself. Like, most of it's boring. Like, I don't know, I'll be driving home from work and you'll put that thing on, the not autopilot, but where it keeps in the lane and it stays the right distance from the car in front. You just kind of sit there. But if I'm driving like down a windy road, then it's like, yeah, I'm going to drive the car myself. Also, probably because the autopilot couldn't handle it, but that's kind of fun. Apparently, Violet preferred to drive the cars herself, as she liked to put the pedal to the metal, whereas she felt Albert Watts drove like a grandma with nowhere to be. I suppose that hiring full-time chauffeur could be viewed as a status symbol, even if you don't intend to use his services. But I suspect it's more likely that Albert Watts was the family chauffeur. Oh, yeah, I totally assumed that. And Violet was just trying to appease her father by occasionally pretending to make use of him. Oh, I totally assumed that this family, they didn't each have their own chauffeur. I mean, that does seem a bit excessive, doesn't it? She might even have let Albert take the wheel as the car was leaving the driveway of the manor house before relegating him to the passenger seat to twiddle his thumbs, whilst Violet showed him how to drive properly. Another way in which Violet Charlesworth defied expectation was the fact that she had a good head for business and enjoyed taking big risks, often startling her own stockbrokers whenever she dabbled in the stock market. It was surprising enough to see a woman throwing around quite substantial sums of money in a ticker jungle dominated by wrinkly old men, but what equally floored the other traders was her young age and the way in which she did it. Upon her first meeting with a team of stockbrokers in a fancy hotel, one of them later revealed, "We were expecting to see a middle-aged woman of the world, but we found a country girl dressed in the best taste with a charming manner." Another stockbroker was struck by Violet's confidence in her long string of bear market investments, which she continually speculated against the market on short-term declines, pulling in sizable profits from falling prices. He was apparently in awe of, quote, Violet's courage of repeated bear transactions when scarcely a man beyond the circle of professional speculation would venture upon bear selling. Yeah, it's much more risky than regular stock market investing because you're betting something's going to go down, and generally over time, stock markets just go up, like if you look at it over a long enough period. And she was pretty good at it too, at least for a while. It was one of her early stock market triumphs that led to her buying the Minerva and a new diamond tiara as a little reward for her shrewd investments. The handbook author, Dorothy Levitt, would probably have just treated herself to a new handkerchief, a new revolver, and an electric cattle prod. So, as Violet was already bringing home some serious bacon without any need for a jackpot inheritance from a war hero godfather, you might wonder just how excited she really was about hitting her 25th birthday and cashing in the check. I mean, yeah, sure, you can make good money in the stock market and all of this stuff, but I don't think she's going to make like that 15 mil. But whilst the Charlesworth family were clearly wealthy, they certainly hadn't yet seen anything close to the equivalent of £15 million. They've got a giant house, they have staff, they got a chauffeur, they've got 7 sports cars. If you're worth less than £15 million and that's your life, I feel like you're overextending yourself, no? And regardless of your current financial position, £15 million is always going to be a pretty cool birthday present stuffed inside a card. Alas, it seems that poor young Violet Charlesworth would never quite make it the full distance, but she came agonizingly close. Crimson and Clover. The patrons of the Shipping Pub in the North Welsh town of, oh my god, Penmaenmawr, maybe, in Conwy County, were enjoying a typical Saturday session on the lash. I haven't heard the phrase on the lash in a while. It means to go out drinking if you're not British. Maybe it means that another in America as well. On the lash, to go out on the lash. Do you say that? It sounds so British, even though he said, yeah, out on the lash. On the bitter night of January the 2nd, 1909. But the high-octane games of dominoes, cribbage, and shove a penny what is shove a penny? Were rudely interrupted shortly after 9 p.m. by the arrival of a young woman in visible distress. This was Lillian Charlesworth. The younger sister of the more widely known Violet breathlessly explained that she was in dire need of help after the car she was traveling in had plowed straight into the seawall at Demon's Turn. Oh wait, is the inheritance going to go to her somehow? Lillian and Violet had spent the day enjoying afternoon tea with friends at a hotel in Bangor and had been accompanied in the car by Albert Watts. That's the chauffeur. I hope that he at least got invited inside for a couple of biscuits, but I suspect he got left in the car all day to have a play with the steering wheel whilst the engine was switched off. I mean, yeah, to be fair, he is a chauffeur. It's kind of his job. And look, I don't know, if I was a chauffeur and they were like, do you want to come inside and play cribbage? I'd be like, nah, I'd just rather sit in the car, thanks. I'm not your friend. I'm your chauffeur. I just want to sit in the car just reading. That's just what I would prefer, genuinely. On the journey back to St. Asaph, Violet had attempted to navigate the devilishly sharp coastal bends in Panmanua, around 20 miles from home, when she lost control of the Minerva and crashed it straight through the sea wall. Albert was still on the scene, feeling dazed and confused, and probably wondering why on earth had been foolish enough to accept such an intensely dangerous position as a non-driving chauffeur. But it was believed that Violet had been thrown through the windscreen and tossed down to the rocks below and into the sea. The whole area was soon swarming with detectives, police officers, trawlers, and volunteers searching for the body of Violet Charlesworth. 3 items of interest were picked up almost immediately close to the crashed vehicle: a pocket map, a suede diary detailing all of Violet's recent road trips, and an expensive tam o' shanter, a traditional floppy Scottish hat, of course, with a fetching pom-pom on the top. There was no sign whatsoever of a handkerchief, a clean veil, or an automatic Colt. But more important, there was no sign of the body. Neither Lillian nor Albert were of much help on the night that the police considered them too agitated to be answering any tricky questions. But then again, it's not as if they would have any inside knowledge on where exactly the body might have landed. No, but they're very useful to talk to in terms of like the last people to see her alive. Do you think the chauffeur and what's her face, the sister, got into some scam to get this money from her somehow? The news of a young and popular woman apparently meeting her death in such a ghastly fashion sent shockwaves around the region and generated mournful headlines in the national press, but only for a very short time, because it didn't take long for Edwardian noses to start twitching in suspicion over certain elements of the accident that didn't entirely make sense. The passengers had been quite fortunate in the way that the car had swerved into a relatively small stretch of seawall. If Violet had lost control of the vehicle just 10 yards further up or down the road, the car would have flown right over the cliffs and plunged about 50 feet into the sea below. Why is there a sea wall? I'm wondering, to me, a sea wall is something that prevents the sea. If there's a big tide, or the sea level rises for whatever reason, then you have this sea wall, which protects the houses by the sea. It's like a concrete construction. Why would it be 50 feet high? Why would it be 50 feet high up on a cliff? I mean, how high do they think the sea's gonna rise?
The wall just got 10 feet taller, believe me. It's got 10 feet taller.
The seawall obviously hadn't done much to protect Violet, but both Lillian and Albert must have been counting their lucky stars that they had quite miraculously avoided any risk of getting a bit wet. Just putting it mildly. Speaking of damp spots, you'd have thought that the scene might have been a lot messier considering that a body had been flung through a windscreen, yet there wasn't a single speck of blood to be found anywhere on the vehicle, nor on the rocks, and the car itself was in surprisingly good shape too, considering that it had just smashed straight through a stone wall. There were a few scratches here and there, and a noticeable big hole in the windscreen, but aside from that, the Minerva was in sparkling condition. There's no way that a car from 1909 goes through a wall with enough force to eject someone through the windscreen and it comes out in relatively good condition, with the other 2 passengers being perfectly fine. This is insane. No one could believe this, surely. In fact, it was safely driven back to the family home without any need to call a mechanic. There's no way! You might have expected the recovery of Violet's body to be fairly swift, as the water directly beneath the cliffs was actually very shallow and calm, and you certainly would have expected the rest of the Charlesworth family to be consumed with grief, yet detectives observed that they didn't seem massively concerned about this turn of events. Guys, you gotta pretend at least. Be like, oh no, my beloved daughter. Come on, you gotta at least pretend. It's true that they'd put up a £20 reward for anyone who found Violet's body, but they forgot to sign the supporting documentation, rendering it worthless. A certain Superintendent Rees also noted, "They have not worried me for details of the search. I have had to send them for details and particulars." It almost sounds as if they were just going through the motions, and not in a particularly convincing way. There's an even bigger mystery regarding the Charlesworth's family fortunes that were piling up long before the crash. Whilst we've rattled through a potted history of the family from the small fragments of supporting evidence, you might well be thinking that we completely skipped a chapter. One minute, the Charlesworths are living a fairly ordinary life in England, and the next minute they're basking in the lap of luxury in a stately manor house in Wales. How did that happen? I assume that the father, who was a businessman, hit something big. While Violet's mother, Miriam, was a homemaker, whilst her husband, John, was still touting himself as a businessman, but still hadn't done anything more lucrative than flogging insurance and a few ship supplies. Okay, so where's the money from? So how did Violet suddenly find herself in a position where she could afford 6 sports cars, 12 St. Bernards, and a quite incredibly expensive wardrobe? Although detectives were not aware of this on the night of the crash, it's a question that had also been bothering a private investigator who had been looking into the life of Violet Charlesworth for a couple of months now. They'd originally been put on the case by a disgruntled lender who were growing increasingly concerned that Violet didn't seem interested in ever giving them their money back. Oh my god, are they just living on credit? Really? The detectives would also initially have been unaware that the very day before the crash, Violet had been served with a court summons for defaulting on a loan. It turns out that Violet Charlesworth wasn't quite all she was cracked up to be, and that Violet wasn't even her real first name. Major General Charles Gordon had never been her godfather, and there was no massive inheritance on the horizon. The whole thing had been a fine example of a massive future payoff scam in which Violet had persuaded friends, fiancés, doctors, lenders, wealthy widows, and stockbrokers to lend her vast sums of money on the promise that they'd be paid back when she had her 25th birthday and received a huge inheritance that never actually existed. What a swizz. That's amazing. Wait, what about her family? Were they all just made up? What about the manor and her parents? It soon became clear to police and the press and the mourning public that they were no longer searching for a dead body on the rocks or in the sea. They were looking for a bogus heiress who was still very much alive and on the run after an attempt to fake her own death had just turned into a belly flop of epic proportions. Yeah, I mean, as soon as you know this, of course the maths on it changes from, oh, I wonder who murdered her for her money to, ooh, she's faking her own death. Paint it black. So, let's rewind to the beginning and take another look at the roots of the Charlesworth family. The woman known as Violet Gordon Charlesworth had actually been born May Charlesworth in 1884. And May was not the face of the original scam. That would have been her elder sister Nellie. Oh, they're in on it together. But back when the family was living in England and Nellie was 18 years old, her mother Miriam took it upon herself to tell a big fat porky to a Dr. Barrett that a young Nellie was set to inherit a fortune of £75,000 on her 21st birthday. The details of this are a little vague, as it's not clear where exactly the money was supposed to come from, or whether Dr. Barrett lent Miriam any money on the strength of it, but he certainly seemed to believe whatever story Miriam had cooked up. The tragedy is that Nellie didn't live to see her 21st birthday, but the idea must have continued to marinate in Miriam's mind as a few years later, when May was 18 years old, Miriam decided to go around telling everyone that May was due to be given a whopping £155,000 on her 21st birthday, over £22 million today, from a mysterious Australian man of Scottish descent known as Alexander MacDonald. This was enough to convince a wealthy widow and kindly neighbour by the name of Martha Smith to lend Miriam her entire life savings, a total of £400 or around £60,000 today. Mrs. Smith never got her money back and later sobbed, "I was simply taken in by them." This, yeah, you gotta be careful. Like, keep an eye on your shit. This may well have been the real route of the journey to a new lavish life in Wales, by which time the story had become a little more refined. May Charlesworth had now evolved into Violet Gordon Charlesworth, and whilst the middle name is clearly a terrible name for a woman, oh yeah, Gordon, that's a dude's name. Apologies to all lady viewers out there called Gordon. It was obviously meant to suggest a genuine connection to the legendary national treasure, Major General Charles Gordon, from whom Violet was now set to inherit £100,000. This was the culmination of a new plan, which had first started to take shape back in England when Miriam and May had discovered that they could pick up expensive silk dresses and jewellery on credit just by mentioning the forthcoming windfall from Chinese Gordon. People in the past. I know people still get conned today, but this feels so obvious. They'd pretty much taken every shop in town for a ride before moving on to Wales to try their luck on a much grander scale. They obviously had tweaked the details a little bit, as Vala was already pushing 21 by the time her family first arrived in Rhyl, and so the date of the big payout sensibly got pushed back to her 25th birthday to allow a bit more time for the scam to flourish. But it certainly did flourish. They managed to swindle money out of stockbrokers, banks, lenders, and even Violet's own fiancé, whilst all the time racking up huge amounts of credit from store owners who were more than happy to furnish the most famous lady in town with whatever she wanted, whenever she wanted it. It's interesting, right? Like, you start off with like something small, and then it's like, because you've managed to swindle some people so far to give you a little bit of money, you can just spin that into more money. I love these stories. And this long-running deception was the sole source of the flashy sports cars, the 12 St. Bernards, the expensive jewelry, the diamond tiara, the rented holiday homes, and indeed the stately manor house and the entire new lifestyle of the whole Charlesworth family. Wait, so she's just conning people and she's putting her whole family up with the con's money. Fascinating. During a time when the average wage was just £70 a year, Violet was raking in around £4,000 a year from the fraud and the booming speculations on the stock market that the scam had helped to fund. Violet worked hard on keeping up appearances. The whole Scottish obsession was probably just another element of her disguise to make her look a bit otherworldly and interesting. Yeah, it's like she can't be a fraudster. She's too weird. She's too eccentric. Posing for photographs dressed in full Highland gear suggested that she shared rich connections with a land that may have seemed much further away back when the world was a bit smaller. Or I suppose she could have just really liked tartan and bagpipes. No one likes bagpipes, really. But keeping up the charade and attracting ever more wealth just got easier and easier over time, because she had grown so comfortable in the role of the woman that she was pretending to be. I would imagine that if you asked a perfect stranger for a substantial loan while you were wearing ill-fitting clothes covered in grey stains and you looked like you just fell out of a skip and smelled like a bonfire, you're probably not going to have much luck. But when you turn up in a sports car and you're already wearing furs and diamonds and tiaras that you don't even have to pay for, you're going to inspire confidence and get showered with even more money and more expensive gifts that are only going to strengthen your image and reputation in time for the next gullible sucker. Yeah, exactly what I said. Like, you get con a little bit and then it makes you look more legit, and then you can con bigger. Although I think, banks and stuff would be used to this, wouldn't they? Like, don't trust the car that someone rolls up in because it could be rented. And whilst this might all sound like a finely crafted jolly wheeze, let's spare a thought for some of those gullible suckers. As well as extracting loans from banks and businessmen, including one stockbroker who alone lent her a total of £10,000, Violet also wormed her way into the heart of a rich doctor by the name of Edward Hughes Jones. The doctor was under the impression that he was in a meaningful relationship with Violet, who would soon become his fiancée. He later lamented, "I was honestly and deeply in love with her." But it seems that Violet was just chasing another big loan. Dr. Edward Jones eventually broke off the engagement because of what he perceived as Violet's utterly bonkers spending habits, but not before he lent her a total of £5,000 on the false promise of a payback. £5,000, just bear that in mind. Didn't we just say that the average wage was £70 a year? That is an extraordinary amount of money. A bizarre personal letter from Violet to the doctor was later unearthed, in which it's painfully obvious that she's still suffering from delusions of being Scottish whilst begging for more money. She writes, "You can, well, all my fortune, when I get it, will be yours as much as mine. It cuts me to the heart to ask you for money. It is cruel, bitterly cruel, but it is all for love's sake. Laddie, and now Eddie, my own, ever your devoted and someday wife, Violet." Oh my god. Like, 1, the Scottish, 2, the old language is just like, what are you saying? She wants money from him, basically. But the really cruel element of Violet's plan is that she often took money from victims who couldn't afford to lose it. That nice widow, Martha Smith, she took her life savings of like £400. God damn. May have had some savings in the bank from the death of her beloved husband, but Violet completely wiped her out, leaving her with nothing. Apparently, Martha was a deeply patriotic soul who had become enchanted by Violet's tales of a daring and dashing godfather, Major General Charles Gordon, and she was only too happy to hand over her entire life savings on the understanding that she'd surely get it all back from the goddaughter of a war hero. Suddenly it all begins to sound a little bit more ruthless, doesn't it? Maybe it wouldn't have been so bad if she'd just stuck to screwing over rich businessmen and bankers. Yeah, I always like the con shows, TV shows, where it's like where you're supposed to support the con artists. I always think of White Collar, great TV show. And it's like you're always backing them because they're always like conning people who deserve to be conned. If the show was just him conning like poor people who can't afford to lose money, you'd be like, what a dick. Of course, the major flaw with the whole fiendish plot is that Violet had given herself a deadline and a pretty significant expiration date for the dastardly scheme in the not-so-distant future. One day very soon, Violet was going to turn 25 and people were going to start noticing that they weren't getting the money back that they'd been promised. Perhaps there wasn't really an awful lot that she could do about that. It would have seemed a bit far-fetched for an inheritance to stipulate that the recipient can only cash in the check when they turn 94. And besides, extending the date of the windfall too long into the future may have dissuaded some of the lenders from playing ball. I'll pay you back in 70 years, buddy. Doesn't quite sound like such a good deal. But the financial problems were already mounting for Violet and the Charlesworth family in general long before it was time to think about putting 25 candles on a cake. Whilst Violet had initially dazzled the stockbrokers with her prowess on the trading floor, her later dealings on the stock market had become increasingly reckless and had gone more than a little pear-shaped. She ended up completely blowing her stolen fortune. In total, she now owed today's equivalent of £2 million, and despite the family still putting on airs and graces in public, the reality was they were flat broke as the clock ticked ever closer to that 25th birthday. I'm not quite sure how the rest of the Charlesworths were supposed to get out of this mess with any dignity, but Violet had clearly decided to rope in the services of Albert Watts and her sister Lillian to stage a desperate last resort, which might just keep the whole pack of disgruntled wolves from her door. Well, I guess the problem is, for them, the debt is with her, and so the family, she dies, the debts that she has are going to pass on to the family. They can take it from her estate, but I imagine that she doesn't really own much anymore, given that she's gambled, she's betted all away on the stock market and stuff like that. Maybe the house and stuff, but probably not in her name. Don't know. You'd have thought that they might have just put a little more effort and thought into the execution of the plan to fake Violet's death. They could have battered up the car a bit more instead of just smashing a hole through the window. They could have thrown a bit of blood around the scene, and they could have found a spot where the water wasn't quite so transparently shallow. Even the strategic positioning of the journal, the map, and the Tam O'Shanter, what was the Tam O'Shanter? Seemed a little obvious and lame, suggesting only that Violet's personal possessions had not traveled very far in the aftermath of the crash, yet her body had vanished without a trace. Yeah, her body was ejected through the windscreen so far into the sea that it can't be found, and the car's completely fine, and so are the other passengers, and all of her stuff is exactly where it's supposed to be. This is the worst fake death ever. It didn't take long for whiffs of suspicion to start wafting over the cliffs at Demon's Turn, which only intensified when the private investigator approached the police with his own findings that Violet Charlesworth had been falsely declaring herself to be the goddaughter of Major General Charles Gordon. This was quickly followed by complaints from a long list of duped lenders for whom the truth had finally begun to rise to the surface in exactly the same way that a dead body had not. Some of those lenders, along with police officers, solicitors, and journalists, descended onto the family mansion in St. Asaph in search of answers and cash, but John, Miriam, and Fred barricaded themselves in for days, refusing to even open the door for the milkman. One newspaper report at the time suggested that the police eventually had to scale the walls of the property to gain access, after which they began to seize everything of value to help pay back the creditors. Okay, so I guess it was her stuff. Or they're just taking it anyway. The initially sorrowful press headlines describing a terrible tragedy soon evolved into sensational reports of a devious fake heiress on the run from authorities, and the story began to make waves right across the world. I think the North Wales Weekly succinctly captured the transformed mood of the region when they observed, as for the people residing in the vicinity of the alleged incident, they don't know where she is, and what's more, they don't care a motor spanner. The history, the historical, what is a motor spanner? I don't even know what it is. And back in the day, it was so common that they would use it like this. And as the police swiftly abandoned the idea of finding a corpse in favor of launching a hunt for the woman in the flowing crimson cloak, sales of crimson cloaks were reported to take a sudden nosedive as potential customers didn't want to risk being mistaken for the fugitive. That might sound a bit silly, but there were plenty of false alarms to begin with, as practically any woman wandering around the UK in a floating crimson cloak or even just driving a car alone was likely to find themselves getting reported to the police by an over-enthusiastic amateur crime fighter. But it was only a matter of days before the police finally got their most promising lead yet. It looked as if Violet Charlesworth had skipped the country. But she hasn't skipped particularly far. She's gone to Scotland, hasn't she? She's gone to the one place that everyone will be like, if she's going to flee to a country, where immediately comes to mind? Maybe the bagpipes were a clue. The woman from Staffordshire had fled to her spiritual home in the green hills and grassy fields of bonny Scotland. Purple Haze. A couple of female guests had turned several heads when they checked into a hotel in the Scottish town of Oban a few days after the supposed car crash. One of them went by the name of Margaret MacLeod and spoke with a curious accent, which came as though she had been a quite posh Englishwoman attempting to sound as if she was born and bred in Scotland. Another curious point about this Margaret MacLeod is that she was the absolute spitting image of the missing Violet Charlesworth. Oh my, what a coincidence she is! Furthermore, she was staying at the hotel with none other than Violet's sister, Lillian Charlesworth. Bro, are you joking? This is the worst fake deaths that I've possibly ever seen. And we've seen a lot of, fake deaths on this channel. The pair of them aroused further suspicion the very next morning by scarpering without bothering to pay their bill. Margaret MacLeod even went to the trouble of cutting their names out of the guest book. And if there are still any lingering doubts as to the true identity of Margaret MacLeod, although there are not, Danny, it was later discovered that the hotel guest had rather carelessly left behind a telegram in her room addressed to Violet Charlesworth. How did you manage to con so many people and now have turned into an absolutely terrible criminal? Like, not terrible like the acts, like terrible at being a criminal. The pair had legged it to the next departing steamer, but news of the sighting had travelled so quickly that a pack of press reporters were already waiting to challenge them as soon as they stepped back out onto the mainland. Margaret MacLeod seemed quite taken aback by the surprise reception, but appeared to be almost amused by any notion that she might be the missing woman, as if such a concept was preposterous. I mean, it's a good way to play it. Just be like, what, are you being silly? I look nothing like her. She admitted that she'd been enjoying following the story herself in the newspapers, but pointed out that Violet Charlesworth had been described by the press as very tall, whereas she was only 5'5.5". If any of the reporters thought to back a tape measure, they could have proven right then and there that Margaret MacLeod is actually 5'7", which by a staggering coincidence was the exact same height as Violet. I mean, so if you're gonna lie fucking bravely, just fucking lean in. But in conclusion, she insisted, "Of course, I'm not Miss Violet Charlesworth. I have no objection to saying who I am. I am Margaret Cameron MacLeod." Lillian didn't have very much to say for herself, other than to completely deny that she was Violet Charlesworth's sister. The strange point about this claim is that there might actually be some truth to it. While the baptism records of Lillian and Violet, well, May as she was back then, indicate that they shared the same parents, later census records list them as cousins. It's difficult to figure out exactly what was going on here, and their true relation remains unknown, but it seems that the Charlesworth children were already getting plunged into some weird kind of identity crisis before the story of the Heiress was born. It might have been handy if some police officers had bothered to turn up to greet Violet and Lillian, but they presumably had better things to do on that day, so the pair were at liberty to walk away from the reporters and make their way to Glasgow. Why aren't you making your way out of the country? Like, Scotland is not far enough. Obviously, the police are going to come for you. You've got to go to Lebanon. Come on. But just how long could this so-called Margaret MacLeod keep up the charade? Well, just one day, as it turns out. By the very next afternoon, Margaret made a complete U-turn and took the odd decision of revealing her true identity and selling her story, or at least a fragment of her story, to the newspapers. Violet Charlesworth had become something of a notorious celebrity figure by this point. Her face was regularly getting plastered all over the newspapers, and the Daily Express had even resorted to selling collectible Violet Charlesworth postcards for 3 pennies each. Of course it was. Daily Express. Still today. Pretty trashy, allegedly. Perhaps that is what partly inspired Violet to come clean and attempt to somehow cash in on the story herself. She accepted the not inconsiderable sum of £400 from the Daily Mail in return for an exclusive confessional interview, although it turns out not to be particularly exclusive, as she'd later agreed to extensive interviews with several other newspapers over the next few weeks, including the Daily Dispatch, who stretched out her life story over 3 weekly installments. Milk that story, Dispatch! However, whilst recent online dives into the story have suggested that this is the point where Violet finally unpacks every last skeleton from the closet, that doesn't appear to be the case at all. She certainly gets off to a promising start by dramatically declaring, "It is no use my denying any longer. I am Miss Violet Charlesworth." But she only actually admits to running away to Scotland and leaving everyone to assume that she was dead without ever explaining the reasons why. There's no mention whatsoever of swindling a whole bunch of people out of vast sums of money based on a tissue of lies. Instead, she suggests that the car crash was genuine and that her decision to flee the scene was an act of spontaneity after becoming separated from Lillian and Albert. Becoming separated. They stay in the car while you flew through the windscreen. Come on now. As she put it, "I gave one wild look around, and then an impulse came into my head to get away from the horrible associations of the place." End quote. Her supposed true life story suggests that her father, John, moved away to America on his own 8 years earlier, which doesn't appear to be the case at all, as he was still very much holed up in St. Asaph, while she reckons that her wealth came from a personal allowance topped up with gifts from family and friends, although details are suspiciously vague. They're suspiciously vague because obviously it's a lie. But having now made quite a bit of money from just selling a crock of shit to the press, Violet decided that she was quite enjoying her new status as a proper national celebrity, and so she decided to keep on milking it for all it was worth, which was quite a bit. Yeah, just fake it till you make it, and then when you've made it, then you make it by selling the story of you faking it. Like, this is ridiculous. She wrote another song, this time cheekily entitled "Goodbye Girlie, I Must Go," which ended up getting licensed to music halls. I assume that is the historical way of being a hit. She appeared in a theatre production at the London Hippodrome called The Cliff Road, in which she played a version of herself reenacting the car crash on stage. That sounds quite ambitious to me for an early 20th century theatre production, but apparently a lot of money was thrown at it and a giant water tank was dragged onto the stage to represent the sea. And she even signed up to play the starring role in a silent movie entitled The Welsh Cliff Mystery, in which she was to play a woman who fakes her own death and then goes on the run from the police. Bearing in mind that she still hadn't confessed to the whole sordid story, I have no idea how the scripts for the theatre play and the silent movie would have managed to flesh out into any kind of plot beyond the driver of the crashed car hot-footing it to Scotland, but I'm assuming that they were both padded out with entirely fictitious elements. Yeah. I mean, like there's loads based on a true story. The true story is like that Cocaine Bear movie. Yeah, a bear ate lots of cocaine and died. They spun a whole movie out of that. It's totally possible. We'll never know about the film, as it never actually made it into production, although Violet was still reported to have been paid a very generous advance. The theatre play was hardly a roaring success either, and the curtains came down for the last time a lot earlier than intended, as audiences had taken to aggressively booing Violet whenever she appeared on stage. Well deserved. Initially, I wondered if this might have been some kind of vocal expression of disapproval regarding her sheer shamelessness at carving out a career in the spotlight based on somewhat dubious acting. Way it's going to be that she just sucks, right? She's not an actress. She has no acting trait. Although she was a really good con woman, so I guess that's kind of acting. But it's going to be that she's terrible, right? But no, apparently she is just a really bad actress. Now, you might be wondering why on earth she wasn't arrested. Yes, she's just wandering around free. She had already been served with a court summons before the crash, and there were plenty of people queuing up to accuse her of fraudulent behavior. It's not as if the police would have much of a problem in tracking her down, considering that she was appearing live on stage at the London Hippodrome most nights. They just go and arrest her on stage. It's like, different ending to today's story, everybody. Thank you for coming. It also seems that Violet was so keen to bask in the glare of public attention, instead of quietly withdrawing to a secret location where she might be forgotten or at least never found. It's likely that she just viewed her new celebrity status as another lucrative money spinner, but it could also be that she believed her fame might actually protect her from the law. The police surely can't go around arresting rich or famous people. That's just not how things worked in Edwardian England. Yeah, I told you, things are different if you're rich in the past. Like, she could drive a car, she could get away with crimes. She wasn't even rich, she was just fake rich. Imagine being really rich. Or maybe it was. It turns out that the police hadn't just fallen asleep for a year. They had been continuing their investigation all this time, and were finally ready to seize their moment at the beginning of 1910, just as the glow from Violet's moment in the limelight appeared to have dimmed. Productions were cancelled, the offers of further work had dried up, the money had been squandered, and now Violet Charlesworth was officially bankrupt. And if she already thought that the year had gotten off to a pretty dismal start, she'd no doubt feel a lot grumpier when both she and her mother Miriam were finally arrested on suspicion of fraud. Oh, we hadn't heard from Miriam in a while. Was she involved in this? Violet to Blue. There were a couple of mystifying elements to the arrests and subsequent trial, which kicked off on February the 23rd, 1910 at the Chester Assizes in England. The first puzzle is why nobody else aside from Violet and Miriam appeared to face any kind of criminal charges. John and Fred Charlesworth must surely have had some kind of involvement or at least knowledge of the long-running scam, and they would certainly have reaped the benefits from it. Barricading themselves in the family house to stop the police from seizing their assets acquired from the spoils of crime can't have gone down too well either. And it must be blindingly obvious that both Lillian Charlesworth and Albert Watts were accomplices in staging the car crash that was meant to allow Violet to flee from justice. Yes, immediately known, because it was the worst fake death ever.
She is the worst. She is the worst person in the world. Huge skank.
But as far as we can tell, nobody seemed too fussed about charging anybody other than Violet and her mother. Another initially baffling point is that although there was a long list of victims who had been duped by the scam, Violet and Miriam only ever faced specific charges of fraud from her former fiancé Dr. Edward Jones and the kindly widow Martha Smith. Whilst it's nice to see Martha fighting back against the fraudsters, there was no sign of any of the other victims, not even the stockbroker who was scammed out of £10,000. And remember, £70 a year average salary. That's someone working for more than 100 years. Oh God. The most likely reason is that some of the conned businessmen are always simply too embarrassed to publicly admit that they had been taken for fools by a young woman. And more to the point, it's not as if they were likely to get any of their losses back from a defendant who had just been declared bankrupt, so why bother? It doesn't look as if either Smith or Jones ever saw their money again, which is a crying shame for the formerly wealthy widow in particular, but their battle in court may have been more of a personal matter of vindication rather than any serious attempt at clawing back their losses. Yeah, look, if she's gone bankrupt, you're not going to get your money back. You're just going to join a line of creditors, and it's just not going to happen. I've been there where I've been owed money by bankrupt companies, and you're like, oh, for fudge's sake, and you just kind of give up and you just write it off because you're like, it's just not going to work out because it's going to be way more headache than it's worth and all of this stuff. But in this case, if she's also been fraudulent, just go if you need to testify in the criminal case because that's going to be way more serious anyway. But Violet and Miriam pleaded not guilty to fraud and their defense reverted to an earlier version of the scam. They denied ever suggesting to their victims that Violet was in line for a big inheritance from her godfather, Major General Charles Gordon, and that was probably a smart move on their part, as it could be easily proven in court that they were not related. Instead, they revisited the far foggier tale that Violet had been promised £155,000 on her 25th birthday from a mysterious Australian man of Scottish descent named Alexander MacDonald. I feel like MacDonald in Scotland's got to be like Smith or Bloggs, right? John and Violet had apparently fallen in love when she was just 17, and the promise had been made shortly afterwards. The only slight niggle is that she hadn't heard from him for several years and didn't know where he was right now, although she helpfully pointed out that last she'd heard he might be living somewhere in Melbourne. She conceded to the jury, "I've been disappointed." The Daily Herald observed the striking differences in the conduct of the two defendants in court. Miriam Charlesworth is painted as a bit of an angry snake, frequently throwing cold and venomous looks at her own daughter, as if everything was her own fault for cocking up a perfectly good plan. Kinda. In contrast, Violet is described as utterly despondent, her pale face and light-framed, hollow eyes that burned with hopelessness. She broke down when the Welsh doctor she had deceived gave his testimony, her agony unmistakably real. And it does make you ponder who exactly was guilty of being the ruthless mastermind driving this whole plot forward. Yeah, maybe it's Miriam, right? The mother. Because she came up with the original con about the 21st birthday and the money. Maybe she's kind of the one behind it all. Violet Charlesworth usually cops most of the blame and fame for her starring role as the bogus heiress. She's even been accused of doing tremendous damage to other women of the era fighting for political rights and social equality. Acclaimed British historian Lucy Wolsey observes, Violet was hungry for riches, for fame, for attention, and to get these things she took advantage of new freedoms, but she did it in a way that wasn't good for other women. Violet's story confirmed a lot of people's worst fears, that empowered women can be dangerous, even criminal. But instead of trying to suggest that Violet was solely responsible for pushing back equal rights for women by years, I do think we need to consider the role played by her own calculating mother. Yes, please. It was clearly Miriam's original idea to start peddling lies about the older daughter Nellie in order to whip up credit for hugely expensive items of clothing that the family couldn't afford. Exactly. And after Nellie died, the scam was passed down to the young and impressionable May Charlesworth, who was given a new role to play and a new responsibility for generating wealth for the whole family. That's not to suggest that Violet was entirely blameless or a victim herself. By the time she reached her early 20s, she could have reassessed her position and perhaps taken time to consider that swindling nice old ladies and your own fiancé out of their fortunes might not be the most ethical way of topping up the bank accounts. No shit. But it's interesting that Violet appeared to show genuine remorse in court, whilst Miriam was just consumed with anger at the position that she now found herself in, perhaps indicating that a manipulative and overbearing mother was furious with her daughter for ruining her plans and letting the side down. It does kind of really seem that that's what's going on, doesn't it? The trial itself lasted for 2 days, during which it became embarrassingly clear that the mysterious benefactor Alexander MacDonald did not exist, and that the staged car crash had been an attempt to flee the consequences of peddling another giant whopper involving a war hero. It took the jury just 20 minutes to find Violet and Miriam Charlesworth guilty of 2 counts of obtaining money by false pretenses and 4 counts of conspiracy to obtain money by false pretenses. It was Violet who got singled out for the most attention from the judge, as he wrapped up the case by describing her as an exceedingly clever and ingenious woman who might have had an honourable and possibly distinguished career if half her ingenuity had been properly directed. It sounds like a school report. Like, Simon has a lot of energy. It's a shame it's not directed towards his schoolwork. Literally is something I must have read many times. He didn't have much to say about Miriam, but maybe he considered her to be a lost cause. They both got exactly the same punishment regardless, as was fairly common in the Edwardian era. They were ravaged to death by a pack of rabid wolves let loose inside the courtroom. No, scrap that. I was looking at the wrong case. The judge initially sentenced the pair to 5 years hard labor, but later felt that it had been a bit harsh and cut it down to 3. Violet and Miriam only ended up serving 2 years of penal servitude before they were released on license in 1912, after which they disappeared into complete obscurity. Fade to grey. This might all sound like a story that could only happen in the olden days, back when people were more reassuringly stupid, but it's strikingly similar to a much more recent story involving the Russian swindler Anna Sorokin, who infiltrated the upper-class New York social and art scenes under the fake persona of wealthy heiress Anna Delvey. There's a great Netflix show about this. Well, it's entertaining. I don't know if I'd describe it as great. It's kind of forgettable, but it's like, I don't know. I love these con artist stories. Between 2013 and 2017, she managed to defraud friends, acquaintances, banks, and hotels to the tune of $275,000 on the strength of a multi-million-euro trust fund that didn't exist. And it seems that she took inspiration from Violet Charlesworth in more ways than one, as she later used this as a springboard for a celebrity career, albeit after serving just under 4 years in prison on convictions of attempted grand larceny, larceny in the second degree, and theft of services. She sold the rights to her story to Netflix in 2022 for the miniseries Inventing Anna, although it was later ordered that she use the vast majority of the money she made from that deal in order to pay restitutions and fines that she had clocked up, totaling nearly $300,000. Since then, her story has been the subject of a stage play, she's written a book, and made countless appearances on television, most recently popping up as a contestant on Dancing with the Stars in 2024, on which she was still legally required to wear an ankle monitor at all times. It sounds as if Anna Sorokin is making a better fist of this shameless criminal celebrity lark than Violet Charlesworth ever managed with her lousy short-lived stage show and unproduced silent film. But maybe the options for building a brand out of bad behavior were a bit more limited back in 1909. You can be sure that if there was such a thing as an Edwardian version of I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, then Violet would have been in that jungle faster than a greased pig. Now, there's still plenty of debate over whether Violet Charlesworth was ultimately a cunning criminal genius or a harebrained wannabe con artist with no cards to deal. Her exit plan certainly left a lot to be desired. Yeah, it's like, it was all going really well under the mother's purview, and then when she decides to do something for herself, it's absolutely ham-fisted and just the worst disappearance ever. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? The stage death could generously be described as amateurish at best, and whilst taking up a new name in Scotland is far less likely to work out when you're travelling with your sister and leaving telegrams behind in your room addressed to your real name. Maybe she wasn't born to be a criminal, often described as charming and generous. Perhaps the life of May Charlesworth would have turned out very differently if she hadn't been raised by a pushy mother flushed with pure greed. Then again, maybe Violet's downfall was propelled by her own pure greed. The wicked plan actually came excruciatingly close to working out for all concerned, and could potentially have been a grand example of the fake it till you make it strategy, leading into glorious triumph with zero consequences. Violet's initial dealings on the stock market may have been financed by money gained from deception, but she was still pulling in some pretty impressive profits. Yeah, for a time, but then it all went wrong. This would have been the perfect opportunity to pay off all of her creditors and set up an entirely legitimate enterprise. The people we now describe as her victims would have been none the wiser that they'd have been hoodwinked. Yeah, we'd have never heard of her. She'd have just got rich and just been like, yeah, no, I got all my money from scamming people. Like, I thought I was scamming them, but I ended up giving the money back with interest and getting rich. Sometimes it works out. It's not as if anyone had ever seen through her quite masterful disguise. The only reason that her plan fell apart is because she continued to squander money on herself while recklessly gambling away the rest on increasingly foolhardy stock market speculation. And this is what led her to the point of desperation and imminent exposure when her 25th birthday loomed ever closer into view and she suddenly didn't have a pot to piss in. It could have all worked out so differently if she just calmed down a bit with the sports cars and the diamonds and the St. Bernards and maybe found herself a better stockbroker. That sharp bend in the coastal road, formerly known as Demon's Turn, is now more commonly known to locals as Violet's Leap. But the final unsolved mystery is exactly where Violet leapt to after leaving prison in 1912. It's believed that Miriam Charlesworth died just 8 years later in 1920, possibly a victim of the great influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1920, often referred to as the Spanish flu, despite the fact that it was thought to have originated in the United States rather than Spain. As for Violet, grave sleuths have recently discovered a death record which lists a certain May Charlesworth, who died in Stoke-on-Trent in Staffordshire in 1957 at the age of 73. It's a shame the cause of death isn't listed. If she'd disappeared after being flung from a dog sled on fire that was about to hurtle over the top of a mountain that was also on fire, I suspect we'd be talking about the same woman. As it is, we don't know for sure. And I just have a feeling that after suffering the shame and disgrace of serving a prison sentence, Violet may have been more tempted to move away to her bonny Scotland under a completely different identity, leaving the shadow of the Charlesworth name behind in England. Such a move would of course now make it nigh on impossible to figure out how exactly Violet Charlesworth spent the rest of her life, but I hope that any wealthy investors of the 1920s kept their wallets firmly in their pockets if they ever bumped into an elegant lady bagpiper in Scotland who claimed to be on the verge of inheriting a vast fortune from Lord Angus Burns, projector of the Tartan realm, guardian of the glens, and keeper of the Highland winds. And that is where we end today's episode. Thank you so much for being here. If you're listening, why not leave us a review on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts? If you're watching on YouTube, hello there. Thanks for being here. And I'll see you next time.